Welcome to the Ultimate Beginner Quilt Series by Fat Quarter Shop. In this series, I'm going to be showing you how to make a quilt all the way from the start to the finish. This series is sponsored by Moda Fabrics and Eversewn Sewing Machines. I'm going to be giving you lots of tips, and we're going to be building our first quilt together. In this video, we're making block 2 of the Ultimate Beginner Quilt series. We're making a simple 9-patch block, and I'm going to be showing you tips on chain piecing and nesting your seams. To see all of our videos, make sure to subscribe to our channel and click the bell to be notified when we have new videos. So let's get started. So I've gone to my quilt kit and I have picked all 9 that go in the kit. And I wanted to show you, in our Notion video, we talked about putting little swatches by our SKU numbers, and this is going to really help us. So for example, we've got 3 greens. We can compare it to our actual fabrics to make sure we're pulling the right ones. So I've got all 9 of my fabrics. My next step after pulling my fabrics is to read my pattern. And this is saying that they're all fabric A's, and from each of them we're cutting one 4.5-inch square. So now I know what I'm cutting, and I'm going to just cut 3 at a time. So I'm going to put these to the side, and when I'm cutting, I like to line up my selvages, which again is where there are dots on the bottom. So I'm just going to pick my first 3 fabrics. They're nice and ironed, and I'm going to cut a 4.5-inch strip first. So again, put my ruler on the left. We're going to make a clean cut on the left. Put my hand firm, unlock my blade, and cut. And then I'm going to find the 4.5-inch line on my Creative Grids ruler. So 4.5, make sure it lines up right here, and cut. And I will move this out of the way. I'm going to rotate my fabrics, make a clean cut on one side, and this has salvage, so you want to make sure you cut far enough away to where all these little dots that are on the fabric go away, because you don't want those in your fabric. So I just kind of check to make sure I've cut close enough in. I'm going to rotate without moving. Then I'm going to line up this top line on my ruler, the 4.5-inch line. Make sure it's all lined up, and cut. I'm going to keep this strip for later on in the kit, so don't throw that away. And we've got our first 3 cuts. Now I'm going to cut 3 more the same way, just to do it one more time, since I think this is the easiest way for a beginner. And then the next time I'll cut a different way. So again, I've got these all ironed, line up my selvages like this. Make a clean cut on the left. And here I like to look to make sure all 3 layers got cut. And if they didn't, then I'd need to make a cut again to make sure we get a clean cut on all 3. Check my 4.5-inch line. Make sure it's lined up all the way across the top. Adjust as you need before you cut, and cut. Set this aside. And before I cut here, I make sure that I line up the top of a line on a ruler with the top of the fabric. Rotate. Try not to move your fabric. Line up the top. Line up the 4.5. And again, like I talked about in block 1, it's really important that you take your time when you're cutting, because you will get more accurate results. So now I've cut 6. I need 3 more. So I'm going to do this one a little bit different. I'm still going to line my fabric up the same where I've got selvage at the bottom. Make sure there's fabric is not wrinkled and there's no wrinkles underneath, because if you have a wrinkle, for example, if this isn't lined up flat and you cut, you're not going to have a good square. So we've got that. Now this is a different technique that you could do, is you could just cut, instead of an entire strip, cut a square from the corner. So to do that, I would kind of start with a 5-inch square. So I've got 5-inch on the side, 5-inch at the bottom, just to cut less so that you don't have the strip left over. So I would cut on one side, the other side. Try not to cut too much into the rest of this because you don't want any cuts in there. Set this aside. Then you could turn your fabric and line up the 4.5 inch on both sides. So that gives you two options. So this is 4.5, 4.5, and then you could cut one side and cut the other side. So those are some options on cutting. Now that we've cut, we are going to get our design board and our pattern, and we're going to lay out our fabrics. So these are all fabric A's, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and pin everything before we go to the sewing machine. So I'm going to put these right sides together, and as we sew, we're going to do a continuous stitch all the way through, and that leaves a little chain between each piece, which is where the name chain piecing comes from, and I will show you how that is helpful. So on these, I'm just going to pin at the top and bottom, but before you pin, you want to make sure they're lined up. So you wouldn't want to pin if it was like this, because it wouldn't be lined up, and you also wouldn't want to pin where the orange is too far on top of the blue. So you want to make sure they're lined up. Pin at the beginning and the end, and I will take my design board to my sewing machine. So we're using a 1/4 inch foot, and you want to make sure your fabric is even. So I can see that the yellow is poking out a little bit, so I'm going to pull that back with my thumb and get it even. It's going to give you more accuracy. Pull your pin out when you get to it. And we're going to keep stitching the next piece and not cut them apart, which is going to put a chain piece in between each. And now we're going to go iron. So if you look at my pieces, you can see that they are connected, and that is considered a chain piece. And that makes it easier when you iron. So you can pull these, and you're going to press according to your pattern. But first, we're going to set our seam by putting the iron flat And then we're going to be pressing toward the yellow and this side. So what I'm going to do now is finger press this direction, get it nice and flat, and then iron. Finger press this way. And you don't want to iron straight on it. You want to push with the iron slightly on that crease. If you just iron flat down, you might get a duck pleat. And you want to finger press this way. Now it's nice and flat. Then we will bring our design board. Put our pieces down. And then we're gonna add our next piece. We're just gonna pin everything in place and then go to the sewing machine and stitch all the way down again. Now at this point, you can cut your chain piece apart or you can leave it together. That's just a personal preference, whichever works best for you. I will probably cut those apart when I get to the sewing machine before I start the next step. And I'm going to chain piece these together. So we're going to do the same thing we did before, just stitch a 1/4 inch down. And now we'll go press. So now we're going to set our seam again. Finger press to one side. If you just get your seams the way that you want them, just helps, especially if you're a beginner. Now, if you were to just iron right now flat on top, you would have creases. So again, you want to put your iron edge right on that crease. And you'll notice I'm not moving my iron like this. That will stretch your fabric. So now we have this. I'm going to put the design board back. And I left that last chain piece in so that they'll all stay together. And now we're going to talk about nesting our seams. So we'll put this right on top, right sides together. And if you look, we have pressed everything in an opposing way, and you can actually with your fingers kind of snap it in place, and you can feel the tension between the left and the right, and you can see that it is completely nested. And once you nest it, you want to put a pin right in that intersection. Okay, so now again, make them nest. They're right next to each other. Hold it in place with 2 fingers. Then place a pin. So you've pinned your intersections, and now you can pin at the beginning and the end and throughout. Pinning is an extra step, but it will make your stitching much more even, especially if you're a beginner. And so now we're going to go back to our sewing machine and we're going to stitch all the way down with a 1/4 inch seam. Now I've pulled my pin out, but I put my finger right on that seam, and that kind of helps it stay in place. And you can see this pink is kind of poking out. So with my finger underneath, I'm going to pull this in. And before I go iron, I'm going to look at my seams to make sure that they nest, and that they do. They're all correct. If they didn't, I would seam rip them, the intersection, and redo them before we go iron. So now we're going to set our seam. We're going to always set our seam before we ever press to one side. We'll press to one side. Again, I'm going to finger press that so it's nice and flat before I keep going. And you can see my intersections are really nice. Now again, you don't want to press down here. You want to put the edge of your iron toward the seam. That keeps that nice and flat. And then we will turn our last piece over, right side together. Again, press the seams. You can feel it nesting. Put your pin in each intersection. And we're going to go stitch down this very last section. So on your machine, if you have a long tail here, what will help is putting your finger right on top of those threads before you start stitching, and that keeps everything from coming unthreaded. And again, I'm going to look to make sure everything nests, and it does, so we'll go press. So we're going to set our seam. Finger press it the way that you want it to go. Put the edge of your iron right on the seam you just stitched. And give it an all-over press. And we're going to trim our block up. So your block should measure 12.5 inches, and if you put that on your mat, mine measures 12 3/8, and that is okay. Your block is never going to be exactly the unfinished size that your pattern says, and that's okay as long as you're consistent throughout. Now I have a little bit of thread coming off the ends, and I like to clean up my block. This is an optional step. You do not have to do this. But what I do is I will put a line on my ruler with one of the seams and just trim the very edge to get it nice and clean. It shouldn't take very much off, and it should just straighten if you have something a little bit crooked. But again, this is totally optional. And our 9-patch block is done. I love seeing all of your blocks. Make sure to share them with us on social media, and I'll see you next week for block 3.